Welcome. You've found your way to a quiet place, a corner of the night where we move more slowly and let the noise of the surface world fade. This channel is a shared vessel for calm journeys into the deep ocean, into hidden layers of our planet that most of us will never see, but can still imagine. Stories shaped by depth, pressure, time, and long stretches of silence. And if you'd like to return to this place again, a quiet like or subscription helps keep these slow journeys afloat. For now, make yourself comfortable, and let's begin our descent. We often picture darkness as the absence of a switch, a curtain drawn, a power cut that can always be reversed with a single movement of the hand. But beneath the surface of our world, there are places where darkness is not a moment, it is the entire history of that place. Miles under the ocean, in deep-sea trenches where the pressure would crush a submarine hull, inside caves that spiral away from daylight, under the thick ancient ice of a glacier that has pressed down for hundreds of thousands of years, there are creatures that have never seen even the faintest glimmer. We're going to spend some time with them, not in a rushed, breathless way, but slowly, as if we were letting our eyes adjust to a room that will never grow brighter. Somewhere, under Antarctic ice, in brine channels threaded through frozen seawater, simple microbes drift and divide in a permanent midnight. In caves, blind fish feel the world through tiny ripples in the water. In the deep sea, soft-bodied worms and small crustaceans move through a cold, silent world that has no sunrise and no sunset at all. Some of these beings do not have eyes to close or pupils to widen. Some do not have a brain in the way we usually mean it, just a loose net of nerves that helps them move and feed and turn away from harm. They can startle, they can retreat, yet the thing we call fear, that tightening in the chest, that story we tell ourselves about danger, may never arise in them. What does it mean to live without that inner voice? What does survival look like when there is no memory of light and perhaps no feeling of being afraid? As you slow your thoughts and let the day fall further behind you, follow me into that question. This journey is meant to be unhurried and soothing, a gentle walk along the edge of a very deep silence, where your body can move toward rest even as your imagination wakes up and wanders. Now, picture what happens if an entire life unfolds without morning, without shadows, without the outline of your own body against a brighter sky. Imagine being born, growing, searching, and finally ending, all in a world that has only ever been dark, and perhaps only ever been calm. In a moment, we're going to step more fully into that darkness and meet the creatures for whom light and fear are both distant, unknowable ideas, the hidden realms beneath our comforting sky. So, from that quiet, unbroken night, follow me a little further away from the comforting sky we know. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and let your thoughts drift down. As if they were small flakes of snow settling through the air, sinking slowly past the last traces of daylight until even the memory of blue has faded into black. We often picture the world beneath a glacier as a single hollow chamber, a kind of icy cathedral with one mysterious lake at the bottom. But this hidden side of Earth is part of a much larger family of secret places. There are trenches in the deep ocean where the seafloor falls 11 kilometers down, sealed caves that have not seen the open air for hundreds of thousands of years, subglacial lakes like Lake Vostok buried under 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice, and even thin films of water threading through the tiny spaces inside rocks and frozen ground. Now, picture what happens when you step into these regions in your mind. They are not dark in the way your bedroom is dark when you switch off the lamp and know that morning will return. They are dark in a geological sense, a darkness measured in layers of rock, in kilometers of ice, in unbroken years and ages instead of hours. There is no sunrise waiting patiently on the other side of sleep here, because in many of these places, light has never arrived even once. Under that kind of pressure and cold, life has adapted by letting go of the things it no longer needs. Eyes cloud over and shrink, or disappear entirely, as in blind cavefish that feel the flow of water rather than seeing it. Pigment drains away from skin and shell because there is no surface light to reflect. Circadian rhythms, those inner clocks that on the surface tell us when to wake and when to rest, become meaningless when every moment is the same shade of black. But there is another axis of strangeness running through these worlds, another way in which they quietly diverge from our experience. Many of the creatures that endure here do not just live without light, they also live without the kind of fear that shapes our thoughts. Worms in abyssal mud, microbes in subglacial brine, drifting jellyfish with only a diffuse net of nerves instead of a brain. They react, they move, they withdraw from harm, yet they do so without the layered emotions we carry. When we feel fear, it is not only the sharp jolt of an alarm. It is anticipation, anxiety, the memory of danger replayed in vivid detail, the way your heart speeds up just thinking about a past fall or a narrow escape. Our nervous systems build stories, connect past and future, imagine what might go wrong. The simple bodies beneath the ice, by contrast, live almost entirely in the present moment. A touch, a change in chemical taste, a sudden current passes over them, and they contract or swim or burrow, not because they are worried, but because the signal has arrived and the reflex follows. Not X, but Y. Not a mind haunted by what if, but a pattern of responses unfolding with no inner commentary. A jellyfish pulsing through black water does not lie awake remembering an almost predator. A bacterium in a microscopic vein of meltwater does not dread the coming century. It simply divides and drifts and responds. So we find ourselves asking a very quiet question. If you remove light and you remove fear, what kind of experience of reality is left for a living thing? In the next part, we're going to move closer to that answer and meet specific creatures from this cold, hidden world to see how a life without sunrise and without dread is actually lived, breath by tiny breath, in the deep beneath our feet. Where are you listening from, compared to their midnight? So before we follow me any farther into that question, before we descend into the places where light and fear never quite arrive, I want to pause with you for a moment and ask something very simple. Where are you right now in this midnight of ours? Are you listening from a warm bed, covers pulled up, phone or laptop the only little island of brightness in the room, your ceiling just a faint suggestion above you? Or are you at a late-night desk, papers and cables scattered, a single lamp making a small circle of gold on the surface, while the rest of the house is quiet? Maybe you're on a quiet commute, train or bus humming beneath you, streetlights sliding past in a slow rhythm outside the window. Wherever you are, make yourself comfortable and just notice the light that is touching you. There is the glow of your screen, cool and steady, the soft spill of a lamp, the distant wash of city light on low clouds, or maybe the pale outline of a window where moonlight presses very gently through the glass. We often picture darkness as an on-off switch, but for most of us, even night is layered with these thin, artificial dawns and twilights. Now, picture what happens if we peel all of that away. Beneath the deepest parts of the ocean, in trenches deeper than Mount Everest is tall, there is no screen glow, no streetlight, no moon. In caves sealed for millions of years, the rock closes over every crack where day could leak in. Under polar ice, in subglacial lakes buried beneath kilometers of glacier, the cold is so complete and the ice so thick that sunlight from the surface might as well belong to another world. That's what a glacier is. In this sense, not just frozen water, but a weight of time and pressure that turns light itself back. As you sit there, notice the temperature on your skin. Do you feel pleasantly warm under blankets, or a little cool in the air around your hands, or balanced somewhere in between? In those hidden places, the temperature hardly changes at all. Deep ocean trenches hover just above freezing. Caves and subglacial lakes stay locked at a narrow, stable cold for years and years, a kind of eternal evening that never tips into day. Here is a small pattern interrupt. If your light went out right now, you would probably feel a quick, sharp flicker of alertness, maybe even a hint of unease. The creatures we're going to visit live where no such change ever comes, where there is no before and after to compare, no sunrise to miss. If you find it soothing to have a quiet, science-filled corner like this to return to, you're welcome, gently, to like this video or subscribe. It helps keep this small, calm space alive, that there is no obligation at all. You don't need to remember every depth, every temperature, every strange name. You can let the words wash over you and slow your thoughts. Knowing will return, will recap, as together we move from your room, your train, your desk, into a world beneath our feet, where light never was, and fear, perhaps, never had a reason to evolve, letting your mind adjust to the dark. So for now, make yourself comfortable again, wherever you are, and let your body do something very simple that we often picture our eyes doing in a dark room, adjusting, slowly, patiently, to less and less light. You might settle a little deeper into the pillow or the chair, let your shoulders fall away from your ears, loosen your jaw so your teeth are not quite touching, and feel your breathing widen out into longer, quieter waves. As your breath slows, your thoughts can slow your thoughts too, as if the busy brightness of the day were a kind of glare on the surface of the mind. And we're going to turn the dimmer down, notch by gentle notch. You don't have to force anything. Just notice the air coming in, the air going out, the way your chest rises under an invisible steady pressure, like ice resting on the deep rock of the earth. Now, picture what happens when we stop looking out towards screens and streetlights, and instead, together we turn our attention downward and outward, away from the familiar surface world. Follow me as we drift below the crust of cities and forests, past the noisy skin of waves and weather, into the long night that waits beneath the polar sea ice, beneath each glacier that has been flowing, grain by grain, for thousands of years. We're not dropping fast like a stone. We're sinking slowly like a snowflake that forgot to stop. The world beneath us is not one flat, empty dark, but a layered planet folded into itself. A bright, thin film of life on top, and then, underneath, quiet strata of rock, water, and ice, where time feels different. That's what a glacier is, in one sense. Not just frozen water, but a moving archive of winters, a cold, patient river that presses down on hidden valleys and basins, and sometimes entire sealed lakes. Some of those lakes in Antarctica and under Greenland have been closed to the sky for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, older than any city, older than our languages, older than the stories we tell about the stars. Imagine that, a drop of water, a pocket of brine, a cave chamber where no sunrise has ever happened, where no creature has a word, or even a nerve, for fear in the way we mean it. In those places, tiny worms sift through sediment by touch alone, blind amphipods feel their way along stone, and microbial films breathe chemical gradients instead of air, repeating the same slow reactions over and over for spans of time that make our whole history look like a brief flicker. How can we hope to understand lives that have never known day and night, never seen the sun, never needed to run? To even begin, we have to match their pace. That means letting go, just a little, of everyday urgency, of the constant sense that something else needs doing. Not racing ahead to the next fact, but resting with this one, that right now, as you inhale and exhale, there are entire ecosystems under ice, under rock, under the deep ocean trenches that would not notice if a century passed. So we'll keep slowing down, letting our thoughts stretch out as we travel further into this permanent midnight toward creatures that live without light, and perhaps without fear at all. The illusion of a well-lit planet. So as we drift with those slow, unhurried ecosystems that barely notice our passing centuries, we can make ourselves comfortable with one more gentle shift in perspective. We often picture the Earth as a bright, familiar place, almost like a postcard we all quietly agree on. Blue oceans glittering in sunlight, green continents veined with rivers and forests, city lights stitched across the night side like delicate threads of gold. From orbit, that image is real enough. Sunlight flashes from the waves, clouds bloom and fade. The polar ice gleams like polished glass. Down here on the surface, our days are marked by shadows moving on walls, by the color of evening, by the way the sky itself seems to tell us what time it is. It feels, intuitively, as if this bright skin of air and water is what the planet mostly is. But now, picture what happens if we step back, slow your thoughts, and think not about surfaces but about volume. Not the thin film where sunlight can reach, but the vastness of everything beneath it. Most of the space on Earth where life can exist is not bathed in light at all. It is cold and deep and permanently dark. Follow me for a moment into that scale. The forests we know, the grasslands, the cities and fields, form only a narrow shell, a fragile wrapping around a much larger interior. Below the sparkling waves, the deep ocean drops into trenches where no sunrise has ever arrived. There is more living space in those dark waters than in all the world's forests and meadows combined. More room for cells and creatures in that quiet pressure than in the sunlit shallows we swim in. Beneath the continents, the rock itself is threaded with pores and fractures, tiny films of water, and chemical gradients that microbes can use as food. They live under mountains and deserts, under glaciers and frozen plains, in a hidden crustal biosphere that may stretch kilometers down. In the polar regions, ice becomes another world. Within and beneath the ice sheets, there are brine channels, subglacial lakes, and buried sediments that hold their own slow, sealed communities. For most of these inhabitants, light is not just absent, it is irrelevant. Their chemistry does not depend on the sun. Their internal clocks do not tick to day and night. Entire evolutionary stories have unfolded there over millions of years, without ever needing to notice that somewhere far above, a star was rising and setting. Imagine, then, that we could turn the planet transparent and gently dim the sun, letting the glare fade away. The bright continents and oceans would dissolve, and in their place we'd see a different Earth, a faint living web spread through dark water, through rock, through ice, a soft glow of metabolism and motion in the cold interior. That is the world we're going to sink into next. A world where fear, as we understand it, may never have evolved at all, and where something stranger waits in the dark. Why fear is not a universal language. So, as we sink into that hidden web of life beneath the ice, we need to slow our thoughts for a moment and ask something simple that turns out not to be simple at all. When we say a creature is afraid, what are we really talking about? We often picture fear as a kind of universal shiver, a shared language that every living thing must speak, from microbes in subglacial brine to seals above the frozen surface. But fear, the way you and I feel it, is not just a flinch. It is a story our brain tells about what might happen next, a tension that stretches from memory into possibility, filling our chest with pressure long before anything actually touches us. Now, picture what happens when you touch something hot. Your hand snaps back before you even know why. That is a reflex, a fast, automatic loop of nerves and muscles that never needs to ask, "What does this mean for me?" Fear, by contrast, arrives slower and stays longer. It draws on the amygdala buried deep in our brain, on the cortex that imagines futures, on waves of stress hormones that wash through the body and keep us awake in the dark. Without that architecture, the feeling we call fear simply cannot arise. Many beings in this cold, deep world under the glacier do not have that architecture. Jellyfish drifting under polar ice carry only a diffuse nerve net, a lace of cells that can contract and relax, but not, as far as we can tell, compose a narrative of dread. Tiny worms in the sediments beneath an ice sheet may have just a few hundred neurons arranged in small clusters that sense chemicals and touch, and nothing like the layered, reflective mind that worries. And microbes sealed in a subglacial lake for thousands of years have no nervous system at all, yet they still turn, swim, or grow away from harmful conditions. We're going to follow me a little deeper into that distinction, because it matters. These organisms respond to the world. They avoid toxins, flee from sudden changes, shift their metabolism when the environment becomes harsh. But response is not the same as emotion, not because they are cold-hearted, but because there is no heart in the emotional sense to begin with, no inner stage on which fear could appear as a character. So when we call such creatures fearless, it is poetic, not precise. They are not brave explorers of the dark in the way a human diver under Arctic ice might be. They are more like intricate chemical machines, exquisitely tuned to survive, but probably untouched by anxiety altogether. Imagine a place so constant, so sealed off from light and sky, that ideas like tomorrow or danger never form inside any mind that lives there. If a creature has never known light and cannot form the feeling of fear, does it make sense to imagine it as afraid of the dark at all? Or are we really just projecting our own surface stories onto a world that moves under the ice without them? A world that will force us, in the next part of our journey, to rethink what inner life might mean in the first place. To understand fearlessness, we must first understand fear. So, to stop projecting our own surface stories, we need to slow our thoughts and ask something quieter, and maybe a little stranger. What is fear, really? When we strip away the drama and just watch what a body does, we often picture fear as a scream, a flinch, a nightmare. But in biological terms, it is more like a coordinated state, a pattern that emerges when three things line up at once: the perception of a threat, the rapid changes that sweep through muscles and blood and breath, and the memory that quietly links a signal in the present to dangers that were survived, or not in the past. Imagine for a moment a familiar mammal on the surface of the earth, something small and warm in the cold night, hearing a sudden crack in the undergrowth. Now, picture what happens inside that body before it even decides anything. The heart begins to pound, sending blood toward the big muscles of the legs. Breathing becomes fast and shallow. Hormones like adrenaline and cortisol spill into the bloodstream, sharpening attention, narrowing the world to a tunnel that holds only the possible predator and the paths of escape. The creature is not calmly surveying the landscape anymore. It is living inside a brief, intense corridor of possibilities. Make yourself comfortable and follow me as we carry that image downward, beneath the ice into the deep sea. Down here, there is no undergrowth to crack, no sudden shadow crossing a beam of light, because there is no light at all. The water is cold, the pressure is immense, and yet the scene is almost impossibly still. Fine sediments drifting like slow snow, pale worms and holothurians moving with unhurried gestures. Years passing in a kind of suspended dusk that never brightens and never quite darkens further. In that upper world of shifting weather and moving predators, fear is deeply adaptive. It belongs to animals that can roam, plan, remember, and choose between several strategies when the world changes around them. A fox deciding whether to dash across open ice, a seal weighing the risk of orcas beneath a thin lead in the sea ice, even a blind cavefish learning which currents once carried it into danger. All of them benefit from a state that says, in effect, this pattern has been bad before. Change what you are doing now. But not all life on Earth lives with that kind of branching, story-like choice. Some creatures, especially the simplest ones, behave less like storytellers and more like sets of rules written directly into tissue. Move toward nutrients, away from toxins, contract when touched, swim when the chemical gradient shifts, with no inner narrator to say, I am afraid, or even, I remember. Their nerve nets, if they have nerves at all, coordinate reflexes and rhythms, not feelings. And under certain glaciers, in brine channels within sea ice, and in subglacial lakes that have been sealed for thousands or millions of years, the environment itself can be so stable, so monotonously dark and cold, that evolution slowly lets go of anything it does not need, including elaborate ways of anticipating danger that almost never comes. So, if fear is this coordinated state, dependent on memory, choice, and change, what happens when nervous systems are too simple to host it, or when the world around them barely changes at all? In the next part of our journey, we're going to descend even deeper into that question and meet creatures whose very wiring suggests that fear as we know it may simply never arise there at all. Glaciers, trenches, and caves as living systems. To follow that question, we have to change how we picture the dark. We often picture a still, empty blackness, as if once the light is gone, the world simply stops. But if we slow your thoughts for a moment and look more carefully, the places without light are not blank at all. They are moving, breathing systems as alive in their own way as any sunlit forest. Take a glacier. We often picture a glacier as a frozen wall, a solid block of ice parked on the land. But that's not what a glacier is. A glacier is a river of ice, flowing so slowly that to our eyes it seems motionless. Yet over years and centuries, it creeps downhill under its own weight, grinding rock into fine powder, dragging boulders, reshaping valleys carved by older ice. Inside that cold body, the ice is not perfectly pure. Now, picture what happens as snow is pressed and repressed. Tiny pockets of ancient air become trapped as bubbles. Thin films of salty water thread their way between crystals, and narrow brine channels open and close with the seasons. In those hidden cracks, under immense pressure, microbes cling to life, feeding on trace chemicals, dividing perhaps only once in many years, yet persisting all the same. We're going to carry that idea downward, far below the last reach of sunlight, into the deep-sea trenches. At first glance, they seem like the ocean's final silence, just a deep gash where nothing much occurs. But down there, the Earth is moving too. Tectonic plates slide and bend, the seafloor slowly deforms, and fine sediment falls like an endless soft snow, burying and revealing in a quiet, continuous cycle. Along the trench walls, chemical gradients form where fluids seep from the crust, bringing up minerals and gases from beneath. Every so often, a distant storm or a plankton bloom at the surface sends a pulse of organic matter raining down, a sudden feast in the dark. Shrimp-like amphipods, strange worms, and other pale scavengers gather in this brief abundance before the long, lean times return. Caves, too, refuse to be the static voids we imagine. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and listen to the way a cave behaves. Cool air sliding in and out with changes at the surface. Thin drafts tracing invisible pathways through stone. Water dripping from ceilings, dissolving limestone grain by grain, slowly widening cracks into passages, and passages into chambers over millions of years. Stalactites grow as minerals precipitate from each drop. Stalagmites rise to meet them, and entire rooms are sculpted by nothing more dramatic than persistent water and time. In some of these chambers, blind fish, pale insects, and colorless crustaceans navigate by touch and vibration, perfectly at home in a world that has never known sunrise. In all these places, life is not surviving despite the darkness, as if enduring some terrible absence. It is woven directly into the flows of ice, water, and rock, small and patient, exquisitely adapted to the slow rhythms of a deep, hidden earth. The darkness is simply part of the environment, like pressure or temperature, something to be used rather than feared. So if we hope to meet creatures that live without fear and without light, we have to stop imagining them as lost in emptiness. Instead, follow me into this moving, textured world where the ground itself is in motion and where the next step of our journey will bring us face to face with the beings that call this restless midnight home. Year after year, darkness builds a habitat. So now that the ground beneath us is no longer just an empty black void, we can let it slow down even further, almost to a standstill in our minds. Make yourself comfortable and imagine that the restless world we just walked through is placed into a time-lapse, years and centuries and ice ages sliding past like the frames of a very quiet film. We often picture snow as something brief and weightless, a soft dusting on a winter morning that melts away by afternoon. But now, picture what happens when it doesn't melt. Not this year, not next year, not for 100 years in a row. Flake after flake settles on polar ice. The layers grow thicker, the lower snow is pressed, grains fuse into firn, then into solid glacial ice, and the weight above deepens the pressure until the whole mass becomes a slow, heavy shield. That's what a glacier is, not just frozen water, but a lid sealing the world beneath from light. Follow me downward, under that lid, as our time-lapse keeps running. Each winter adds a little more thickness, each summer fails to take it away, and over tens of thousands of years the ice darkens, the last hints of blue fade, and the sun becomes a memory that never quite reaches the rock, the water, or the microorganisms that wait in the cold beneath. Once light stops arriving, nothing here ever expects it again. Far from the poles, in the deep ocean, a different kind of snow is falling. Tiny fragments of dead plankton, mineral grains, and organic dust drift slowly through the water column, a constant, gentle rain that never stops. On the floor of a trench, 5, 6, even 10 kilometers deep, this rain builds blankets of sediment, soft and fine, piling up millimeter by millimeter over millions of years, until the hard rock is buried under a cushioned bed that muffles movement and change. Down there, the water is near freezing, the pressure is immense, and yet the landscape is strangely stable. Valleys do not flood with sunlight. Mountains do not cast moving shadows. For small worms, echinoderms, and pale amphipods wandering across that dark seafloor, the world is a quiet, predictable place where the only signals that matter are the faint touch of a current, the trace of a chemical, the vibration of something passing by. On land, caves are conducting their own very slow experiment. Water works its way through cracks in limestone, drop by drop, carving channels, opening rooms, and then, just as patiently, gravity and collapse begin to close the way back. Entrances narrow, boulders fall, passages choke with debris, and some chambers slip entirely out of contact with the day. What begins as a shaded hollow becomes, over hundreds of thousands of years, a sealed interior where daylight never reaches again. In all these places, the pace of change is glacial in more than one sense. The ceiling of ice thickens so slowly that microbes and tiny invertebrates can adjust. The trench sediment deepens so gradually that its inhabitants live and die on a floor that feels almost timeless. Cave walls creep and drip and shift, but on scales so long that a fish or insect can spend its entire evolutionary history in roughly the same pool, the same tunnel, the same quiet lake. Stability is the real architect here. In a stormy environment where light comes and goes, where seasons flip quickly from bright to dark, evolution has to keep many options open, and eyes, pigment, and day-night rhythms remain useful. But in these deep, steady habitats, where the sun is not just hidden but irrelevant, natural selection can begin to strip things away. Eyes cloud over, then shrink, then vanish entirely. Skin loses pigment because there is nothing to see, and no need to hide. The daily clock inside cells drifts, then dissolves, because there is no sunrise to keep it on time. Over enough generations, what remains is a kind of life that no longer anticipates dawn, and no longer waits for sudden danger to appear out of the light, because light itself has been edited out of its world. Some of these beings still startle and withdraw, their bodies wired for simple reflex, but the constant expectation of threat, the restless scanning of a horizon, never develops. In the next part of our journey, We're going to step into these finished habitats, under glaciers, in caves, and on trench floors, and meet the creatures that have followed this slow path all the way to a life that never expects light, and perhaps never truly knows fear. When eyes become useless decorations, so when we finally step into these finished habitats and make yourself comfortable inside this idea of a world that never expects light, we also have to notice something else. In many of these bodies, the eyes are still there, but only as quiet, useless decorations. We often picture eyes as the essence of an animal, bright and alert, but in the deep cold beneath glaciers and in caves, vision slowly becomes a luxury no one can afford. Eyes are not cheap. To grow a working eye, a creature must build a clear lens, a light-sensitive retina, layers of pigment, and then wire all of that back into the brain, where more delicate neural tissue has to sit ready every moment to process the signals. That tissue is hungry. It burns energy. It needs oxygen and nutrients. It takes up space inside a skull already under pressure to do other things. In a harsh place where food drifts by rarely, every extra cell has a cost. Now, picture what happens when light disappears for years at a time, then for millions of years in a row. In that kind of permanent midnight, a damaged eye is no longer a disaster. A mutation that clouds the lens, misroutes a nerve, or erases pigment does not mean death, because there is no sunrise to miss, no predator's shadow to see. Those changes simply stay. Generation after generation they accumulate, not because the world is cruel, but because the world has stopped rewarding sight. The Mexican blind cavefish is one of the clearest examples of this slow unraveling. Its surface relatives still swim in rivers under the open sky of the warm earth, with dark eyes, scattered spots of color along the body, and a faint shimmer when they turn near the surface. But follow me down into the cave populations, and their descendants move through a different world. The sockets are there, but skin has grown gently over them, like a soft curtain drawn across a window that no one looks through anymore, and the body has turned pale and almost translucent, a ghostly outline drifting through the underground water. This is not a sudden transformation. It is a quiet, unhurried process, stretched over deep time. Tiny shifts in each lineage, a little less pigment here, a thinner retina there, a slightly smaller bundle of nerves, add up until the eye is reduced to a buried remnant or disappears entirely. Not overnight, but over countless lives. And, as the sensory world simplifies, as vision fades and the environment beneath the rock or the ice becomes stable and predictable, something else can soften too. The need for complex fear responses, for rapid visual scanning and constant emotional alarm begins to ease. Why invest in the machinery of terror if almost nothing ever changes? In the next part of our journey, we're going to ask what fear even means in a body like that, and meet the creatures that may have let it go almost completely. Life in a world with no sunrise and no schedule. So if the landscape is quiet and the threats are slow, our usual sense of time. We often picture fear as a sudden spike, a sharp peak in an otherwise steady day. But to have a spike, you first need a day, a rhythm, a background beat that rises and falls like light itself. On the surface of the earth, almost every creature you know lives by that beat. Humans, birds, trees, tiny insects in the grass, all carry circadian rhythms inside their cells. Internal clocks, tuned by the cycle of sunrise and sunset, that tell the body when to sleep, when to wake, when to eat, when to release hormones that keep us warm and alert, or cool and drowsy. We feel it as morning energy, afternoon slowness, late-night yawns. Even if you close the curtains, your body still remembers where the sun should be. Now, picture what happens when there is no sunrise to remember. Beneath a glacier, in a cave sealed for millions of years, in the deep abyssal trenches where no ray of light has ever reached. There is no dawn and no dusk to reset those clocks, no daily change in brightness to whisper, now it is day, now it is night. The world is not just dark, It is also timeless in a very particular way. In laboratory experiments, when we take surface animals and remove light cues, their rhythms drift. Sleep and feeding slide out of sync with any 24-hour schedule, sometimes stretching, sometimes collapsing, like a watch that has lost contact with the radio signal that once kept it precise. But in creatures that have lived for countless generations in permanent darkness, something deeper happens. The clock itself can fade. Follow me into a limestone cave or down along the cold mud of a trench. Mexican blind cavefish, pale and eyeless, no longer show strong day-night cycles in their activity. They move, feed, and rest in patterns that are irregular, guided more by currents and chemistry than by any inner sense of mourning. Many deep-sea worms, sea cucumbers, and amphipods simply graze and drift whenever food arrives, their bodies responding to pulses of falling detritus from the surface, or to slow changes in pressure and temperature, rather than to any hidden ticking inside. Imagine living like that, without the phrases you quietly use to organize your own life. Later tonight, tomorrow morning, next week. Instead, there is only a steady flow of now, broken not by alarm clocks and sunsets, but by a faint plume of nutrients, a passing vibration, the touch of another body in the water. In Antarctic subglacial lakes, microbes and tiny invertebrates may pass thousands of years in this continuous present, their chemistry humming along at low temperature, barely changing from one moment to the next. In such a place, fear, as we usually mean it, an uneasy anticipation of future harm, starts to lose its shape. If there is no clear later, what does it mean to worry about it? Reactions become simpler, closer to pure reflex. A flinch from touch, a brief withdrawal from a harsh chemical, a tightening of muscles when the water moves too fast. Not dread, just adjustment. Because somewhere beneath all that ice and rock, life may have traded the weight of expectation for this lighter, almost dreamlike way of existing. In the next part of our journey, we're going to sink even further into that state and ask what a nervous system looks like when it has almost no room left for fear at all. Jellyfish, worms, and the simplicity of not being afraid. So, from that almost dreamlike way of existing, let's slow your thoughts even further and drift toward creatures whose entire bodies are built around that simplicity. We're going to stay in the cold, in the dark, in the quiet world beneath the ice, but now we'll look more closely at what it actually means to have just enough nervous system to move, and almost none to worry. Imagine a jellyfish suspended under Arctic sea ice, a faint bell of tissue pulsing in the dim green water. There is no central brain inside that bell, no single command center weighing options or replaying memories. Instead, a diffuse web of neurons forms a ring and a lattice, a nerve net that wraps through the body like a delicate mesh, passing signals along without ever gathering them into one place. Now picture what happens when a current shifts or a particle brushes its tentacles. Electrical impulses ripple through that net, muscles contract, the bell folds and opens, and the animal rises or falls. The same simple waves of activity can tighten tentacles, steer around an obstacle, or pull away from a sudden touch. It is coordination without contemplation, movement without a story attached to it. Comb jellies, drifting nearby like tiny glass lanterns, work in much the same way. Their rows of beating cilia flash and shimmer, controlled by scattered neurons and small clusters of cells, enough to let them swim, to turn, to follow faint chemical traces in the water. They can avoid what harms them and approach what feeds them, yet there is no evidence that they can form complex feelings, no layered memory of threat that returns later as something we would recognize as fear. We often picture fear as universal, as if every living thing must feel some shadow of what tightens in our chest. But systems like these simply do not have the architecture for it. They trigger contractions, not anxieties. They register contact and pressure, not dread. Deeper in the sediments, or in brine channels threaded through sea ice and subglacial lakes, Tiny worms and nematodes carry this simplicity even further. Some of them have only a few hundred neurons in total, and yet those neurons quietly orchestrate feeding, mating, and the most basic avoidance behaviors. A chemical gradient shifts, a touch arrives from the wrong direction, and the body bends away. No hesitation, no anticipation, just a change in posture and path. When we set these lives beside our own, the contrast becomes almost overwhelming. Our layered human brain takes sensory input from eyes and ears and skin, routes it through deep structures that compare it to years of memory, and weaves it into emotional experiences that can linger long after the danger is gone. We do not just step back from the edge of a crevasse. We replay it later, beneath a warm blanket, heart racing at a threat that is no longer there. These simple creatures are not courageous for staying where the water is dark and the pressure is high, and they are not reckless for drifting under a glacier's heavy underside. They simply inhabit a world where danger is met with action, not with stories of fear. And as we follow me a little further into that world, we'll find beings whose nervous systems blur the line between these two ways of existing, and ask, where in all this ice and shadow, feeling truly begins? The deep sea, a planet within a planet of endless night. So, make yourself comfortable again, and let your attention drift from the underside of the glacier to the open ocean beside it, where the ice gives way to a different kind of darkness. We often picture the sea as a single blue mass, lit from above, but beneath that moving surface is a layered world, stacked like a slow, cold staircase into night. Follow me as we sink down through that staircase. At first, we are in the sunlit zone, the thin skin where light can still feed drifting plants, where waves glitter and most of the stories we tell about the ocean begin. Now, picture what happens as we keep going, as the brightness fades to a dusky blue, then to a dim, underwater evening that scientists call the twilight zone, where day and night blur into a permanent muted glow. We keep falling. The last usable sunlight disappears somewhere around 200 meters, then 1,000, depending on water and ice and season. And the world around us becomes the midnight zone, a place where the sun might as well not exist. Here, the pressure climbs to dozens, then hundreds of times what we feel at the surface, and yet the water itself feels strangely empty of light, as if the very idea of day has been pressed out of it over years and years. People sometimes imagine this region as a carnival of glowing monsters, all teeth and lanterns, but that is only part of the story. Deeper down, even bioluminescence thins out, and long stretches of the deep sea settle into a soft, uniform darkness, broken only by the slow fall of organic snow from the living world above, and the occasional, almost silent passing of a body or a drifting fragment of ice. On the seafloor here, small bodies do the quiet work of turning that falling food back into life. Deep-sea amphipods, shrimp-like scavengers, hurry over carcasses with eyes that are reduced to pale specks or lost entirely. Isopods, distant relatives of the woodlice you might find under a stone on land, crawl methodically across the sediment, their flattened fawns pressed close against the cold mud. Holothurians, the sea cucumbers, inch along like slow breathing tubes, feeling rather than seeing the world. Imagine trying to navigate this place the way they do. Not by sight, not even much by sound, but by the faint push of currents against your body, by the taste of chemicals dissolved in the water, by the subtle pressure of sediment grains against soft skin. For them, the world is a map of touches and traces, a hidden landscape written in gradients of salt and decay instead of lines and colors. And deeper still, where trenches cut into the earth, like inverted mountains, and the pressure becomes almost unimaginable. We're going to meet creatures for whom light is not just absent, but meaningless. Beings that have never once had to evolve a wordless sense of fear about something bright approaching out of the dark, because in their world, brightness simply does not exist. Down there, the concept of day falls away, and with it, much of what we think a nervous system is for. That is where we are headed next. Trench dwellers, surviving pressure without panic. So we keep sinking, past the last faint traces of blue, past the level where most deep-sea life still feels the distant rhythm of day and night, and we enter a part of the ocean that has never known either one. Down here, in the trenches that cut into the crust of the earth like inverted mountains, light is not just rare, it is impossible. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine this place. A narrow scar in the seafloor, deeper than the height of the tallest glacier of ice on land, filled with water so cold it hovers just above freezing, pressed by a weight of ocean that would crush a human submarine if its shell were even slightly flawed. The pressure is hundreds of times what we feel at the surface. Yet nothing creaks, nothing complains. Life is simply here. We often picture such a trench as chaotic and violent, but most of the time it is quiet, slow, almost meditative. Soft-bodied amphipods, little crustaceans that look a bit like translucent shrimp, drift and hop along the mud, their flexible membranes and gentle gel-like tissues bending rather than breaking under the deep pressure. Inside them, special molecules cradle their proteins, so they keep working, even when every bond is being squeezed from all sides. Nearby, sea cucumbers and pale worms move with the same unhurried certainty, as if the whole world has agreed there is no need to rush. Now, picture what happens when we ask ourselves what fear would mean here. There is no sunrise to miss, no looming shadow to signal a predator against a bright background, no sudden flash of light to startle an eye. Many of these trench dwellers barely have eyes at all, or only simple light-sensing spots that may never register a single photon in their entire lives. Their days, if we can call them that, are not measured in colors but in currents and chemicals. Their nervous systems are thin threads and small knots of cells, tuned not to emotions but to changes. A slightly stronger vibration along the seafloor, a faint shift in the taste of the water that hints at decay upstream, a tiny difference in pressure that means something large has just passed overhead. These are not stories or worries, they are signals, followed by reflex. A trace of toxin drifts by, and an amphipod turns, almost lazily, down current. A sudden pulse in the mud, and a worm stiffens, then folds itself a little deeper into the sediment. No panic, no anticipation, just a wordless turn or twitch, and then the long routine of feeding and drifting resumes, as it has for thousands, perhaps millions of years. The pattern interrupt, if there is one, is us. We bring the idea that danger should feel like something, that survival should come with an inner narrative of fear and relief. Down here, beneath the surface, danger is simply a difference in the water, and survival is the body's quiet agreement to move away. As we leave the trench and follow me toward other lightless worlds, we're going to see how far this calm, almost emotionless way of existing can go, and what it means for creatures even simpler than these. Caves, cathedrals of stone where eyes fade away. From that drifting calm of the trench, we rise in our minds and step sideways into rock. Make yourself comfortable for a different kind of darkness now. Not the weightless dark of water, but the still, echoing night of stone. We're going to walk into a cave far from the sea, where the air is cool and dry, and the silence feels almost like a physical pressure on your ears. Follow me down the narrow passage, where our lights brush over rough walls and then vanish into a chamber so wide, the beam never finds the far side. Here, beneath the surface of the earth, pools lie perfectly still, mirrors of black that never knew a ripple of wind. Stalactites tap out a slow rhythm, drip by patient drip, building cathedrals of ice-like stone over thousands of years, while corridors branch away into places that have never, in their entire history, seen daylight. We often picture caves as temporary shelters, places animals visit and then leave, but some creatures never come back out. These are the troglobites, the obligate cave dwellers, whose entire world is carved from limestone and shadow. Imagine a blind cavefish gliding through a subterranean stream, a translucent salamander resting under a ledge, pale crustaceans sifting through sediment on the bottom of a silent pool. Not one of them could survive for long on the bright, changing surface we call home. Now, picture what happens when evolution has no use for the sun. Over many generations, eyes cloud and shrink, then vanish into smooth skin. Pigment fades until bodies are milk white or faintly pink, as if the color has simply drained away. In compensation, other parts stretch and sharpen. Antennae grow long and delicate. Fins become extended feelers. The lateral lines of cavefish turn into exquisitely tuned instruments, reading every tiny vibration in the water, every faint chemical trace drifting past in the current. When scientists compare blind cavefish to their surface relatives, they find that the darkness has changed more than bodies. It has rewritten reactions. Surface fish, startled by a shadow or a sudden movement, show strong stress responses, a flurry of hormones and frantic darting that we easily interpret as fear. In the cave forms, those same triggers often produce a muted response, a brief adjustment of position, a slow turn rather than a panicked sprint. The world here is so stable, so stripped of sudden shocks, that constant high alert would almost be a waste. So in these stone-sealed worlds, fear as we know it may be softened into something else, not a spike of terror and release, but a continuous, low, almost meditative attentiveness to touch and flow, to the faint tremor of a distant footstep, or the slow swirl of water in a pool. But what happens when we leave even these cathedrals of stone behind and go deeper still, into places where the rock itself seems to drink in every signal, and life must feel its way through the dark grain by grain? Under the ice, subglacial lakes and brine channels. So now, follow me a little farther, as we leave the stone and the narrow pores in rock behind, and sink instead into a wider, smoother darkness, where the world is made almost entirely of ice. We often picture Antarctica as a white, empty sheet at the bottom of the Earth, a flat brightness on a map. But beneath that calm surface, the ice is heavy, restless, and endlessly patient. Over thousands and thousands of years, snow piles up, compresses, and turns into ice that can be more than 4 kilometers thick, and that weight presses down on the bedrock with an almost unimaginable pressure. Under that pressure, the bottom of the glacier begins to behave less like a solid and more like something that can creep and flow, and the rock beneath it flexes and sags. Now, picture what happens when a little geothermal heat from deep inside the Earth seeps upward into that squeezed boundary. The ice at the base can melt, even though the air above is far below freezing. Where the bedrock dips, that meltwater gathers, and over long spans of time it can form entire lakes, sealed away under the ice. Lake Vostok is one of the most famous of these. A vast hidden body of water, roughly the size of a small country, lying beneath nearly 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice, and cut off from the open air for perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, maybe more. There are dozens of such subglacial lakes, connected by slow rivers and channels that no human eye has ever seen directly. But the story of life here is not only about those deep, dark lakes. Within the ice itself, especially where a little salt is trapped, tiny veins and pockets of very salty water, called brines, thread their way through the frozen mass. They form thin films along crystal boundaries, branching networks of liquid only fractions of a millimeter wide, yet continuous over surprising distances. In these brine channels, microbes drift and cling, and in some polar ice, tiny invertebrates like nematodes and rotifers can slowly awaken, feed, and then pause again, all within a world that looks solid to us. Make yourself comfortable with the idea that for these organisms, there is no sunrise, no sunset, no seasons of light and dark. There is only a stable cold, a steady crushing pressure from the ice above, and a trickle of chemical energy and nutrients that arrive so slowly you could measure them in centuries. This is a place beyond day and night, beyond weather, where change is so gradual that a single shift in salt concentration might span many human lifetimes. In such a world, what would fear even mean? There are no sudden shadows, no chasing predators bursting from behind a rock, almost no rapid events at all. The microbes in Lake Vostok, the tiny animals in brine channels, respond to touch and chemistry and temperature, but their lives unfold on a timescale so smooth that complex anticipatory fear would offer little advantage. Instead of sharp spikes of terror, there is a continuous, quiet negotiation with the surrounding ice and water, a long, deep patience. And as we move on, we're going to visit other realms where light has vanished too, and ask whether fear itself begins to thin out and disappear when the world stops changing quickly enough to justify it. Lake Vostok and the clues it gives us. So, from that long, deep patience, follow me to one very specific place where the world has been practicing it for a very long time. We often picture Antarctica as a flat, white emptiness, but beneath that ice, there are mountains, valleys, and in at least one case, a lake so large and so sealed away that it might as well belong to another planet. This is Lake Vostok. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine it. A body of fresh water roughly the size of Lake Ontario, stretching hundreds of kilometers, with depths that fall past 500, 600, even more meters, yet all of it buried under nearly 4 kilometers of solid ice. No wind touches it, no sunlight reaches it, the air above it is among the coldest on Earth, and the pressure from the overlying glacier presses down with hundreds of atmospheres of weight. For millions of years, this hidden lake has been cut off from the surface world, yet scientists have found a way to listen to it without truly opening it. They do not drill straight into the water, because that would flood the system with modern microbes and chemicals. Instead, they stop just short, sampling the refrozen ice that slowly accretes from the lake upward, like a frozen message pushed toward the surface over long, slow years. Inside that accreted ice, under the microscope, they have found microbial cells, fragments of DNA, and chemical signatures that whisper of an active ecosystem below. Tiny organisms feeding not on sunlight, but on chemical energy from rocks, from dissolved gases, from the slow grinding of ice against the bed beneath. Not a thriving forest, but a sparse, persistent community, surviving in the dark. To reach even that faint evidence, every step has to be almost painfully careful. Drilling fluids are filtered and sterilized, metal parts are cleaned and baked, instruments are designed so that if they ever did touch the lake itself, they would leave as little trace as possible. It is not just technically demanding, it is almost ethical meditation. We slow our thoughts, we plan, we rehearse, because one careless move could overwrite a record that has been sealed for perhaps 15 million years. Now, picture what happens if, somewhere in that water, there are not only microbes, but multicellular creatures, small worms, or crustaceans, moving by touch and chemistry alone. Any such beings would have evolved in unbroken darkness, under stable, nearly changeless conditions, guided by simple reflexes rather than complex anticipatory fear. No sunrise, no predators swooping from above, no sudden storms on the surface to force rapid learning. That's what a glacier is, at this scale, not just frozen water, but a roof over an entire self-contained world. And if such quiet, lightless worlds can exist beneath our own ice, what might wait in the buried oceans of other planets and moons, where the roof of ice is thicker, the pressure higher, and the darkness even more complete? Microbial cities in stone and ice. To understand those buried oceans and the worlds they might hide, we have to keep shrinking our view, leaving behind even worms and tiny crustaceans, until the animals disappear altogether and only cells remain. We often picture life as something that swims or crawls or thinks, but beneath the ice, beneath the rock, there is a different kind of living city, one that has never seen light and never needed a mind. Follow me, not downward in a dramatic plunge, but inward, into the pores of stone and the thin films of water that thread through permafrost and subglacial mud. In those cramped, cold spaces, under enormous pressure and sealed away for hundreds of thousands of years, communities of bacteria and archaea slowly divide, repair themselves, and trade bits of genetic material running on chemical energy that seeps from minerals and trapped gases instead of sunlight. No sunrise ever reaches them. It never has. Now, picture what happens inside a single grain of sediment lodged far beneath a glacier. Tiny channels hold briny water, just liquid enough to move a few molecules at a time. In that narrow world, cells cluster on mineral surfaces, forming thin films only a few micrometers thick, passing nutrients from one to another, building a patient economy where waste from one species becomes food for another, and where a single cell division might take months or even years. This is not a city of streets and lamps and noise, but a slow, patient city of reactions and bonds, of electrons handed from rock to cell and back again. There is no nervous system here, no brain, not even the simplest ring of nerve cells that a jellyfish might use. What we call decisions in these microbes are shifts in chemistry, changes in which genes are switched on, which proteins are made, which direction a molecule of food happens to diffuse. They cannot be afraid because there is nothing inside them that could ever generate fear. It's tempting to imagine them as lonely or buried, but for them, there is no above to miss. Light is not absent, it is irrelevant, never part of their evolutionary story, never written into their sensory world. A ray of sunshine and the crushing dark under a kilometer of ice are, to these cells, exactly the same. Here is the quiet pattern interrupt. Most of the living mass on Earth may be like this, not roaming forests or oceans, but sitting in rock fractures, in frozen ground, in subglacial sediments, living slowly without eyes, without fear, without any awareness that a sky or a surface exists at all. And as we're going to see, even when life becomes larger and more complex in the darkness, traces of this deep, untroubled simplicity remain. How we study worlds we can barely reach. And when life becomes larger and more complex, our view of it does not suddenly become clear. It stays fractured, like light trying to pass through thick, ancient ice. So make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts, because we're going to step back and look at how we even know these dark worlds are there at all. We often picture exploration as boots on the ground, hands on rock, eyes looking directly at a landscape. But beneath a glacier, or under kilometers of ocean, we almost never get that. Instead, we listen and we infer. From aircraft and satellites, we send radar pulses down through the ice, watching how the echoes change when they cross from cold, solid ice to a smoother, wetter layer. A tiny shift in timing, a softening of the signal, tells us there is a lake, a hidden river, a whole flooded basin pressed under unimaginable pressure, even though no one has ever seen its surface. Seismic waves give us another, equally indirect language. We tap or explode or vibrate the earth at the surface, and then we wait for the ripples to return, altered by every layer they pass through. Now picture what happens when those waves cross a pocket of water beneath the ice, or a zone of fractured, warm sediment far below the seafloor. The pattern changes, subtly but unmistakably, and from those changes we sketch the outlines of deep habitats that no instrument has yet entered. Every so often, we do manage to send something down. Through a borehole, drilled with hot water or carefully filtered fluid, before the ice can close again, a camera or a sampler might descend for a single brief visit. In the ocean, deep-sea submersibles and remotely operated vehicles hover in the black water, their lights carving out small cones of visibility in an otherwise endless night. They glide along the sea floor, past blind worms, pale holothurians, and slow drifting jellies that have never experienced sunlight, and they record only what happens to cross those narrow beams. Most of what we know about the deep, dark biosphere comes back not as vivid scenes, but as fragments. A liter of water filled with strange microbes, a cylinder of sediment drawn up from beneath Antarctic ice or from abyssal mud, its layers compressed years upon years deep into the past. A few minutes of shaky video of a cave pool, or a single still image of a crustacean that will vanish into a crack the instant the light touches it. That is our window, because, just like the underside of the polar ice we visited earlier, many of these cold, hidden places resist us. Boreholes refreeze, cables snag, batteries die, the glacier keeps flowing, the sea ice keeps drifting, the earth keeps moving under our feet, and by the time we return, the world beneath has already rearranged itself. So when we talk about the inner lives of these beings, about fear or the absence of it, we have to hold on to a kind of scientific humility. Our view is narrow, our visits brief, our measurements indirect. To imagine what it is like to exist forever in darkness, without a sky, without a surface, we have to let evidence guide us. But we also have to admit how much we cannot know, and live with that uncertainty as we follow me a little further into their silent world. The engineering problem of touching the untouchable. So as we follow me a little further into their silent world, we have to pause and look at something very human, the awkwardness of our own hands. We want to reach down into that darkness, to touch the creatures that live without light, and perhaps without fear. But the tools we use are heavy, bright, and loud in a place that is soft, dim, and quiet. Make yourself comfortable for a moment, and imagine the path we ask our machines to take. To visit a deep-sea trench, we drop them from the surface through kilometers of water that grow steadily colder and darker until the pressure is hundreds of times what you feel at sea level. Metal bends, seals strain, electronics shiver in the cold. There is no quick phone call to the ocean floor. Signals crawl, batteries drain, and any robot we send must decide many things on its own. We often picture exploration as a ship on the horizon, or an astronaut on a new world. But here it is more like releasing a small, blind beetle into a vast cathedral of water, and hoping it finds the altar. The trench floor is mud that can swallow a probe, currents can tip it over, and a single mechanical failure can turn a decade of work into a quiet, sinking object, vanishing into the deep without a trace. Under ice, the engineering problem becomes even stranger. Now picture what happens when we try to drill through kilometers of frozen water to reach a hidden lake sealed for hundreds of thousands of years. The ice is not just a barrier. That's what a glacier is, a slow river of solid that flows and deforms, squeezing boreholes shut as soon as we melt them open. Our drills must stay hot enough to keep a narrow shaft from refreezing, yet clean enough that not a single living cell from the surface rides along. To avoid contaminating a subglacial lake, every drop of water we pump, every cable, every sensor must be sterilized, then kept sterile as it passes through ice that is itself full of ancient microbes. The equipment must survive crushing pressure, deep cold, and the constant urge of the ice to heal, to close, to erase the wound we are making in it. Even when we succeed, the hole may last only days before it pinches shut again. There is a delicate irony here. We build thick metal housings to resist pressure, bright lights to see in the dark, propellers to move through still water, and then we lower them into ecosystems that may be as fragile as a soap bubble. Trying to study a community of slow-growing microbes or transparent worms with these devices is like trying to gently touch that bubble with a steel rod. The heat from a lamp, the turbulence from a thruster, a trace of oxygen from the surface, each one can disturb or even erase the very patterns of life we came to observe. So we hold back, not because we lack curiosity, but because we are beginning to understand the cost of satisfying it. Many of the fearless creatures in these dark places may never be seen in their true homes, only inferred from chemical shadows and faint genetic traces. And yet, in that distance, a kind of mystery survives, a quiet reminder that some worlds beneath our ice and ocean floors will remain untouchable, until, perhaps, we learn to build tools that are as soft and patient as the darkness itself, and meet a form of life that changes what we mean by fear. But before we can imagine those future encounters, we need to ask something more basic. What does it actually mean for a living thing to live without fear at all? Returning to the core mystery, life without light, life without fear. So let's pause with that question for a moment and let everything else grow quiet. Make yourself comfortable and slow your thoughts, because we're going to return to the core of this mystery we've been circling. What it really means to live without light, and perhaps to live without fear. Follow me back through the places we've already visited in this hidden world. We've sunk down into deep-sea trenches where the pressure is so intense that our familiar idea of the ocean almost stops making sense, and the water above feels as heavy as a glacier of liquid. We've drifted through caves where the rock closes in, where no sunrise has ever reached the walls. We've looked beneath subglacial lakes sealed under kilometers of ice, and into the tiny pores inside stone, and across the midnight zones of the deep sea, where the surface of the Earth might as well be another planet. In all of these cold, enclosed places, life has taken on a different shape. We often picture animals with bright eyes and clear colors, but down here, eyes grow cloudy, then vanish. Pigment fades, then is deleted altogether. The Mexican blind cavefish, pale and sightless, feels its world through the faint currents of water along its skin. Many trench-dwelling worms and amphipods have only the barest hint of light-sensing cells, or none at all. Inside the pores of rocks, microbes and tiny invertebrates live with no eyes, no pigment, no need to know that day is even a word. Their nervous systems, when they have them, are often simple, more like scattered nets than centralized brains. A jellyfish pulse, a worm flinch, a tiny crustacean's kick away from a touch. These are reflexes, automatic patterns that fire when something presses, or stings, or changes in the water. But does a reflex mean fear? Fear, as we know it, is not just movement. It is the feeling that blooms before and after the movement, the memory, the anticipation, the story we tell ourselves about danger. For many of these creatures, there may be no story at all, only the event. Not, I am afraid, but simply, I contract. Not a dread of what might come, but a brief mechanical response to what is. In that sense, they are not brave, and they are not cowardly. They are outside the scale we use to measure courage. And the darkness around them, it is not a threat, not an absence to be worried over. It is the default condition, as normal as daylight is for us at the surface. Now picture what happens when you have never seen the sun, never seen even a flicker of bioluminescence, never learned that light could reveal danger or safety. In subglacial lakes that have been sealed for hundreds of thousands of years, in brine channels within sea ice, in the deep ocean's endless night, organisms live in a steady, unchanging dimness that asks nothing of them emotionally. Because somewhere in this spectrum, between pure reflex and rich emotion, evolution has been quietly editing fear itself. In the next part of our journey, we're going to linger with specific creatures, blind fish, brainless drifters, rock-dwelling microbes, and watch how, over millions of years, life plays with light and with the very possibility of being afraid. Blind cavefish, when losing fear becomes an advantage. So, follow me a little further into this spectrum, down into a place where fear has been thinned out, pared back, almost edited away. We're going to leave the open ocean and the ice-covered lakes for a moment and slip instead into a limestone hill, into a tunnel of rock and water where no sunrise has ever reached and no shadow can ever fall. Here, in caves of Mexico and other corners of the earth, lives a small fish that has quietly abandoned the usual rules. We often picture fish as skittish creatures, flashing away at the slightest movement above the surface, their bodies primed with stress hormones that surge whenever a dark shape passes overhead. But blind cavefish, the descendants of ordinary riverfish that wandered underground thousands of years ago, do something different. In many populations, when scientists gently startle them or expose them to a mild threat, the usual spike in stress chemicals is blunted, delayed, or barely appears at all. Imagine that for a moment from the fish's point of view. There is no light here, no day and night, no sudden silhouette of a predator dropping out of the sky. The cave is a closed world, carved in stone, its water cold and still, its ceilings low, its pressures changing only slowly over long years. Predators are rare or absent, but food is rare too, drifting in from the surface in tiny pulses or growing as thin films of bacteria and algae on the rocks beneath. In that kind of place, being easily frightened is not a gift, it's a cost. A surface fish that bolts at every hint of danger wastes only a little energy, because the river brings constant food and constant change. A cave fish that panics and flees each time it brushes a rock, or feels a faint vibration in the water, might burn through the few calories it has, and in a world this resource-limited, that can be the difference between surviving the season and quietly vanishing. Now, picture what happens when fear loosens its grip. The blind cavefish, guided by its lateral line and taste and touch, explores more boldly, sweeping along the walls, pushing into narrow cracks, sampling every faint chemical trail that might lead to something edible. Reduced stress responses mean less time frozen in place, less time hiding, more time mapping the hidden landscape of the cave. Not because the fish is brave in any human sense, but because evolution has tuned its body so that caution no longer dominates. On the surface, the same species tells a different story. Their eyes are useful, and so is fear. A flash of movement above can mean a bird, a bigger fish, a sudden end. Heightened stress responses help riverfish learn, remember, and avoid the most dangerous parts of their world. Not all fear, but the right fear, in the right amount, under the right sky. In these paired fishes, separated by rock and darkness, we see how flexible evolution can be. Fear is not a universal good or a universal burden. It is a sliding scale, adjusted to match the cold arithmetic of each habitat, whether it lies beneath a glacier, under the open sky, or in a cave that has forgotten the sun. And it leaves us with a quiet puzzle. In a world where nothing sudden ever appears out of the darkness, what is left for fear to warn you about? And what happens in even deeper places when life lets go of it almost completely? Invertebrate reflexes startle without story. So to follow that puzzle a little further, we're going to leave the big, slow bodies of fish and salamanders behind and look at creatures that are simpler still, where fear, if it exists at all, has been thinned down to something almost mechanical. Make yourself comfortable and imagine not a mind weighing options, but a tiny body that just reacts, the way ice cracks when the pressure becomes too much. Now picture what happens when a fingertip brushes the back of a small shrimp hiding beneath a stone in a cold tidal pool. In less than the blink of an eye, it snaps its abdomen, flicks its tail, and shoots backward through the water. A perfect little escape jump that it performs the same way every time. No hesitation, no apparent weighing of the world, just a signal traveling along a few thick nerve fibers, straight from touch to motion. Earthworms offer another version of the same story. A sudden vibration along the soil, a shadow crossing the surface, and the body contracts in a smooth, practiced wave, pulling the worm deeper beneath the ground. In some crustaceans and insects, we can trace these startle pathways almost like wires in a very simple machine, from a sensory hair or eye through a handful of neurons to the muscles that yank the body away. These are fast responses, stereotyped and precise, built to outrun danger by not stopping to think about it. They do not seem to need anything like conscious awareness. No inner voice saying, "This is bad." no image of a predator looming out of the dark. In many invertebrates, the nervous system is a loose ring or a ladder of small clusters rather than a single deep brain, a layout that is excellent for quick reflexes but probably poor at weaving the long layered stories we associate with emotion. We often picture fear as something that must feel like something on the inside, a cold weight in the chest, a tightening in the throat. Yet studies of insects, worms, and small crustaceans suggest that while they clearly avoid harm, their neural circuits may never assemble that extra layer, the one that turns signal into suffering. Behaviorally, they startle, they flee, they freeze, but they do so with the regularity of a metronome. A gentle way to think about it is to imagine a thermostat on the wall of a quiet room. The air cools, a tiny switch closes, the heater hums to life. There is no dread of winter in the device, no relief when the room grows warm again, only a rule followed faithfully for years. In much the same way, these small animals respond to danger signals as if the universe were nothing but, if this then that, an endless chain of conditions and reflexes beneath the surface of awareness. Here is the pattern interrupt. Most of life's dance with danger might actually be like this, automatic, efficient, and emotionally silent. Not a failure of evolution, but a different solution. One that works perfectly well in the cold, hidden places under rock, under ice, and under the gaze of predators that never pause either. And it leads us toward an even stranger question. If so much of the world survives without stories about fear, what exactly are the few creatures that do have those stories gaining in return? Tardigrades and nematodes, the indifferent survivors. So let's stay in those cold, hidden places a little longer and slow your thoughts even more, because some of the quietest survivors on Earth carry that emotional silence to an almost perfect extreme. We're going to shrink ourselves down now, in imagination, until the grains of sediment beneath a glacier rise up like boulders around us, and the thin films of water between ice crystals feel like deep, slow rivers. Here, tucked in moss on a mountain, sealed in a film of ice on the polar surface, or buried far beneath in ancient mud, live tiny bear-shaped creatures called tardigrades. We often picture bears as powerful roaming animals, but these water bears are so small that a thin layer of frost could be an entire world to them, each crystal a kind of frozen cliff. And yet, for all their softness under a microscope, they endure things that would crush almost anything else we know. When the water around them disappears, when the cold drops far below freezing, when radiation passes through the ground with invisible pressure, a tardigrade does not run, or hide, or worry. It simply folds into itself, curls its legs inward, and enters what biologists call a cryptobiotic state, a kind of suspended animation where metabolism almost stops, where years can pass like a held breath. Now, picture what happens when warmth or moisture returns. The body slowly rehydrates, the tissues relax, and the animal uncurls, as if waking from a sleep it never really felt. Nematodes, the slender worms that thread through soil, sediments, and even the thin water veins inside ice, share a similar indifference. Their nervous systems are astonishingly simple. Just a few hundred neurons arranged to control feeding, locomotion, and reproduction, with no extra space for tangled stories about danger. Signals come in, muscles respond, the body turns, swims, or burrows. There is reaction, but not reflection, movement without mood. Some nematodes have been found frozen in permafrost, locked away for tens of thousands of years, then revived when brought back to gentler conditions, as if time itself were just another layer of ice to slip beneath. Others dry out in moss or leaf litter, or wait in deep sediments under lakes and glaciers, their cells fortified, their tiny bodies reduced to patient specks of potential life. Tardigrades do the same on roofs, in gutters, in polar deserts, scattered across the Earth's surface like microscopic seeds of endurance. For them, Survival is not about anticipating what might happen next, not about fear sharpening attention or memory. It is about enduring whatever does happen, passively, quietly, with a chemistry that can pause and resume without complaint. In their world, danger is not something to worry about, it is something to outlast. Make yourself comfortable with that idea for a moment, because it hints at a way of existing where pressure, cold, and darkness are simply conditions, not threats. And if such creatures can cross years of ice and desiccation without ever needing fear, then our next question almost asks itself, what does life look like when even movement and waking become optional? When existence itself thins out to the edge of stillness, yet never quite disappears? Chemosensory worlds, feeling the water instead of seeing it. To reach that edge of stillness, we have to let go of one more assumption, one that sits so deep in us we barely notice it. We often picture a world as something you see, a horizon, a color, a shape moving against a background. But beneath the ice and beneath the surface of our own expectations, there are creatures for whom a world is something entirely different. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine that sight has never existed, not even as a forgotten possibility. No sunrise, no shimmer, not even the faintest glow of bioluminescence. In a deep trench, in a cave river, under a cold glacier lake, animals drift and crawl through water that has been dark for millions of years, and they build their reality by tasting and feeling instead of looking. Chemon sensation, for them, is not a special extra sense. It is the map itself. A blind amphipod under Antarctic ice reads the water the way we read a landscape, following tiny gradients of dissolved chemicals that whisper of food upstream, or the faint familiar trace of a mate somewhere ahead. A worm in the deep sea moves along a film of decaying matter, its body lined with receptors that can tell fresh nutrients from old safe rock from toxic seep, all through the subtle pattern of molecules brushing past. Now, picture what happens when we replace colors with flavors and scents. The world becomes a flowing tapestry of sweetness and rot, of metallic tang and soft organic warmth, each patch of water carrying a memory of what has passed through it minutes or hours before. Where we might see a flat, empty plain of mud, these animals sense a detailed history written into the chemistry of every droplet. It is not vague. It is specific, information-rich, and constantly renewed. Alongside this, there is mechanosensation, the art of feeling movement itself. Follow me into that darkness and think about how a fish with no working eyes still knows the exact moment something large passes nearby. Along its skin runs a lateral line, a row of tiny sensors tuned to pressure changes and vibrations, so precise it can feel the shadow of a current, the echo of its own wake, the distant thrum of another body turning in the deep. Cave insects extend long antennae that register the slightest ripple. Even a small jolt in the substrate becomes a clear signal, almost like a sound you can touch. In such places, the world is not drawn in outlines and edges, but in gradients and tremors, in the slow turning of a chemical tide and the soft push of a passing wave. Fear, if it exists here at all, is not a looming shadow on the wall. It is a sudden sourness in the water, a sharp spike of unfamiliar molecules, a jarring pulse of pressure that says something big has moved too close, too fast. And somewhere even deeper, there are beings for whom those shifts are not frightening at all, merely another pattern in the dark waiting to be felt. What happens to fear when even those patterns begin to thin? When movement fades and a life becomes almost entirely still? When movement fades and a life becomes almost entirely still, we find ourselves brushing against a quieter mystery. Can there be fear when there is almost no sense of a someone to be afraid? As we slow our thoughts and let them sink into this cold, hidden world, a different kind of question appears beneath the usual science of nerves and reflexes. Many researchers think that emotions like fear are not just raw reactions, but woven patterns of awareness, stitched together over time. For fear to arise, there has to be at least a faint integrated sense that there is a me here, and that something in the near future could harm that me. Not a poetic self, not a story with a name and a history, but a minimal ongoing point of view that says in effect, this body, this place, this moment are mine. Without that thread, the feeling may unravel into something simpler, just input and output. Now, picture what happens in a simple worm living in the dark sediments beneath an ice-covered lake, far from any surface light, pressed under the weight of years of frozen water. Its world is gradients of chemical taste, tiny changes in pressure, the faint scrape of particles drifting past. It contracts when a noxious molecule touches its skin. It turns when the water around it shifts. It pauses when the temperature slides a fraction of a degree. Each movement follows the last like beads on a string, but there may be no one holding the string at all. In creatures like this, the body does not need to carry a rich image of itself extended through time. There is no remembered childhood, no imagined future, perhaps not even a stable sense of "I am here" that lasts longer than a heartbeat of electrical and biochemical activity. Instead of a continuous self, there is a sequence of local events, each one arising and fading in the deep, dark water, like tiny ripples on a lake that never sees the sky. That does not make these beings unimportant or lesser. On this earth, under all this ice, they are astonishingly well fitted to their place, able to endure pressures, temperatures, and darkness that would end us in moments. Their lives trace out possibilities of existence we can barely imagine, reminding us that the world beneath the glacier is not a simpler version of our own, but a different way for matter to be alive. Still, a puzzle remains. When that worm withdraws from a stinging chemical, but carries no concept of itself, no sense of tomorrow, is it meaningful to say it is afraid? Or are we just projecting our own midnight anxieties into a body that only reacts and never worries? We often picture fear as universal, as old as life itself, yet here at the deep edge of awareness, the word begins to blur, its outline softened by the cold. Follow me for a moment into that blur, and notice what happens if we do not force a sharp answer. Perhaps the safest thing we can say is that something is happening there, something structured and purposeful, but whether it deserves the name fear may remain hidden from us, like a valley sealed under a glacier. In the next stretch of our journey, we're going to stay with that uncertainty and ask what it means for us to talk about experience at all, in a world where so much of life may never know it exists. Historical glimpses. First encounters with the lightless creatures feel or don't feel. Follow me back a little, into the first moments when we even realized they were there at all. We often picture the deep ocean and the inside of caves as empty, a kind of absolute absence stretched out under the surface of the earth. But for a long time, many scientists quietly agreed with that picture. In the 19th century, when the first deep-sea dredges scraped along the sea floor, some of those ships were heading out under a very simple assumption that below the reach of sunlight, life would thin out and then vanish. The pressure would be too high, the cold too intense, the distance from the surface world too great. Instead, when they hauled the dripping nets back over the rail, they found starfish and brittle stars, pale worms and strange crustaceans, soft bodies from water so deep that no one on deck could really imagine it. The abyss was not barren at all. It was crowded. Now, picture what happens when you lower a lantern into a cave instead of a dredge into the sea. Early cavers, edging into limestone passages with flickering flames and the sound of their own breath for company, expected rock, water, and silence, not residence. Yet, as they crawled through narrow tunnels and chambers that had never known the sun, they began to notice small, almost ghostly movements against the stone. White millipedes with no pigment, spiders with long, delicate legs and eyes reduced to dark pinpoints or gone entirely, blind fish tracing the current with their lateral lines, drifting where a river had carved its way beneath the hills for thousands of years. For those humans, fear arrived easily. A misstep on wet stone, the weight of rock above, the thought of ice or earth sealing the entrance behind them, all of it pressed in on their chests. In the deep sea, storms raged overhead, ships creaked, and the black water below the keel felt like a fall without end. But the creatures they disturbed did not share that tightness in the lungs. A cave beetle, moving with unhurried certainty along a ceiling, did not know it was in a confined place. A deep-sea holothurian, a sea cucumber resting in the dark beneath kilometers of water, did not know it was under crushing pressure. Our fear of darkness and confinement, the way our thoughts speed up in small rooms and under cold night skies, colors everything we see in these hidden habitats. We step into a cave and feel it as a trap. Its residents feel it as the whole world. We lower instruments under ice or into deep water and imagine a kind of permanent emergency. The animals there inhabit a steady, almost timeless night. Make yourself comfortable with that contrast for a moment, because as our lights get brighter, our robots tougher, and our drills more precise, we're going to carry those same human feelings into even stranger places. Subglacial lakes, deeper trenches, maybe oceans beneath the ice of other worlds. What forms of life will we meet there that move through darkness as calmly as these first pale fish and blind insects, not just lightless, but perhaps as close to fearless as life on Earth can be? Future probes into perpetual night. To reach those almost fearless lives, though, we will need tools that move through darkness with a kind of patience that matches the creatures themselves. We often picture exploration as loud, bright, and decisive, but in these hidden places, beneath the ice, the future may belong to machines that melt, drift, and listen more than they cut or drill. Imagine for a moment a melt drill no bigger than a tree trunk, lowered gently onto the surface of a glacier. It doesn't spin or grind. It carries a warm metal nose that slowly turns solid ice into a thin sheath of water, letting it sink under its own weight, hour after hour, day after day. Now, picture what happens when it reaches a subglacial lake that has been sealed for hundreds of thousands of years. Instead of punching through and stirring the cold water, it pauses, lets the pressure equalize, then opens like a quiet flower and releases a handful of tiny, sterile probes. Those little probes would be baked, washed, and sealed so thoroughly that not a single living microbe from the surface world could survive the journey. They would drift out into the dark water, carrying only soft lights in wavelengths that fade quickly, chemical sensors that sip the lake instead of gulping it, and cameras that can see in near blackness. The goal is not to conquer the lake, not to claim it or transform it, but to visit it the way we might step into a silent room at night, careful not to wake whoever is sleeping there. Far below sea ice and steep continental slopes, something similar is already beginning with autonomous underwater vehicles, and in the years ahead they may become even more like patient ghosts. Instead of roaring propellers and blinding beams, we're going to send quiet gliders that ride density layers in the water, mapping trenches and cave systems with pings of soft sonar, and with noses tuned to tiny changes in chemistry. Each pass might add only a thin thread of information, but over time, those threads could weave a three-dimensional map of an entire deep world. Follow me a little further into this future. Make yourself comfortable and slow your thoughts for a moment, because the next explorers may be almost too small to see. Picture micro-robots the size of grains of rice, or flexible, bio-inspired sensors that move like worms through wet sediment, or like slender fish along the roofs of flooded caves, bending with the currents instead of fighting them. They could cling to rocks, feel vibrations, taste minerals, and then detach and drift on, leaving almost no trace that they were ever there at all. In a way, these tools ask us to rethink what exploration means. Not a flag in the ground, but a listening ear. Not a floodlight, but a patient eye that learns to see in the dark without burning it away. And somewhere, under another shell of ice far from Earth, in the deep oceans of a moon like Europa or Enceladus, the same gentle technologies might one day slip through alien ice, enter an unlit sea, and discover that the first beings we meet there have never seen light, never known fear as we understand it, and yet still have something to teach us that we are not at all prepared for. Europa, Enceladus, and the echo of our own dark oceans. So when we turn our eyes outward, past the clouds and the thin shell of our own atmosphere, we're not really leaving this story behind at all. We're extending it. We're going to follow those ideas of dark water and silent creatures into places where the sun is little more than a bright star, and yet oceans may still move and breathe beneath the ice. We often picture moons as dead rocks, cold and airless, but some of them are more like frozen lanterns hiding their light on the inside. Europa, circling Jupiter, and Enceladus orbiting Saturn are wrapped in thick shells of ice, and beneath that ice, all the evidence we have suggests there are global oceans of liquid water, kept from freezing solid not by sunlight, but by the slow kneading of tidal forces and the faint warmth of rock below. On Earth, that idea used to sound impossible until we learned to listen to our own hidden waters. Beneath Antarctica's 4-kilometer thick ice, and under Greenland's vast glacier sheets, subglacial lakes sit in perfect darkness for hundreds of thousands of years, and yet they are not empty. At deep-sea vents along mid-ocean ridges, where sunlight never reaches, entire ecosystems gather around hot, mineral-rich springs, powered by chemistry alone instead of photosynthesis. Now, picture what happens when we put these two worlds side by side. In both cases, life has found a way to exist without day and night, without seasons, without the familiar rhythm of dawn. Microbes in subglacial lakes feed on dissolved minerals and gases. Communities at hydrothermal vents build food webs from the reactions between water and rock. If such strategies work here, under our own ice, and at the bottom of our own seas, why not in the deep interior of Europa's ocean, or in Enceladus's buried sea, where we've already seen plumes of salty water erupting through cracks and venting into space? Make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine what a creature there would be like. No eyes, because there is nothing to see. No sense of sunrise, because there has never been one. Perhaps only a sensitivity to chemical gradients, to tiny changes in pressure, to the faint warmth of a distant vent. Would such a being know fear in any way we would recognize, or would it simply move when conditions changed, drifting or crawling along the seabed in perfect, untroubled response? Here on Earth, many of our simplest animals already live this way, especially in caves, trenches, and subglacial channels where light never penetrates. Their reflexes are sharp, but there is no sign of the layered, anticipatory fear that shapes the behavior of a mammal standing under an open sky. By studying these almost emotionless lives, these pale worms and blind fish and microbial mats beneath the ice, we slowly learn how to imagine other oceans more honestly. And there is a quiet, unsettling possibility that follows from this. What if most life in the universe, if it exists at all, spends its entire history in darkness, never knowing starlight, never developing eyes, never needing to be brave, only to respond to gradients and flows in a patient chemical dance? If that's true, then our bright, anxious, fear-colored world at the surface of Earth might be the exception, not the rule. And the real common story of life is being written, right now, in the deep and the hidden, where ice and water meet in the dark. Ethics in the dark. Should we disturb the fearless if the real common story of life is being written in the deep and the hidden? Then we have to ask a quieter, harder question. What happens when we show up, with our bright tools and noisy curiosity, in a place that has never needed to be afraid of anything at all? Before we rush in, make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts with that idea. Beneath Antarctic ice, under kilometers of frozen weight and pressure, there are subglacial lakes that have been sealed off from the surface, for hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years. Their water has never touched the open air. Their microbes have never met a leaf, a skin cell, or a speck of soil from our world above. Now picture what happens when a drill, even a careful, sterilized one, opens a narrow throat of connection between these two worlds. A single surface microbe that slips through. One spore, one bacterium that likes cold water a little too much, could outcompete the native life before we even understand what we've disturbed. We often picture exploration as planting flags and collecting samples, but in these dark places, taking a sample can mean rewriting an entire ecosystem. Subglacial lakes, deep caves, and the soft sediments of ocean trenches are not just remote, they are fragile in a very particular way. Energy arrives there slowly, as faint chemical gradients or drifting particles, so everything grows and recovers on timescales of years, decades, sometimes longer than a human life. If we scrape a cave wall coated in pale microbial films, or stir up a trench floor with a heavy robot, the scars we leave may persist long after we are gone, long after anyone remembers why we went there in the first place. And the inhabitants themselves, these almost fearless beings, cannot run from us. A blind amphipod in a cave stream, a worm in the mud beneath a glacier, a microbe floating in a subglacial lake, has no way to anticipate our arrival. No instinct that says, hide, something enormous is coming. They simply continue their patient chemical dance until a pressure wave, a burst of warmer water, or a cloud of foreign cells sweeps over them. So we have to ask, does our desire to know, to see, to measure, truly outweigh the risks we impose on lives that cannot say no? Perhaps instead, we're going to learn a different style of exploration, one that matches the quiet of these places. A gentle, patient approach where we send smaller instruments, sample less often, leave more untouched, and design our technology to vanish back into the ice or the mud without a trace, begins to feel like a kind of respect, not conquest, but listening, not extraction, but careful conversation with a world that never raises its voice. There is also a softer boundary we might choose to honor, one that is not made of ice or rock, but of restraint. Maybe we accept that some lakes will never be drilled, some caves will never be mapped to the last chamber, some trenches will remain only faint outlines on a sonar screen. Sometimes, not knowing everything is a form of care, a way of letting other stories continue without us as the main character. And yet, if we hold back like this, how do we decide which mysteries to touch and which to leave in the dark, still writing their secret chapters beneath our feet? What our fear reveals about us. If those secret chapters are still being written without us, then this is a quiet moment to turn the page inward, just for a while, and look at the stories unfolding in our own minds. Make yourself comfortable and slow your thoughts, because to understand why we fear the dark, we first have to notice how quickly our imagination rushes in to fill it. We often picture darkness as a kind of presence, a heavy, cold substance pressing in from all sides, even though it is simply the absence of light. Now, picture what happens when the lights go out in a familiar room. The furniture hasn't moved, the walls haven't shifted, the air is the same temperature, yet suddenly the heart beats a little faster, sounds sharpen, and the simple act of crossing the floor can feel like stepping over the edge of a trench. Our brains begin to sketch outlines where there is only empty space. On a winter night, a hallway in your own home, a forest path, the open ocean beyond the last ring of a ship's lamps on the surface of the water. In each of these places, nothing has changed in the physical world. But inside, whole scenes unfold. We imagine eyes watching from the tree line, a shape at the end of the corridor, something just beyond the circle of the flashlight. Light becomes a kind of reassurance, a thin, bright glacier of certainty laid over the unknown terrain of our thoughts. Now, beneath real ice, in a trench kilometers deep, or inside a limestone cave that has never seen the sun, there are creatures for whom this same darkness is not a threat, but simply the background of existence. A blind cavefish drifting through black water does not miss the day. Its world is touch and faint currents, pressure shifts along its skin. Polychaete worms on the deep seafloor, tiny microbes in subglacial lakes, jelly-like animals with no central brain at all, move, feed, and divide in a permanent midnight that does not need comforting. They startle, they withdraw from harm, they respond to chemicals and movement. But as far as we can tell, there is no story wrapped around those reflexes, no inner narrative that says, "This is danger," in the way we do. Our fear says more about the layered, storytelling architecture of our brains than it does about the cold places themselves. The dark is not cruel. It is indifferent. From an evolutionary point of view, that quickening of the pulse in a shadowed doorway is a kind of tool shaped over many years on open plains and in dense forests, where hearing a rustle and assuming the worst could mean survival. Fear narrows our attention, primes our muscles, keeps us from walking too close to the cliff edge or the thin ice. It is not a flaw in the system. It is part of how the system learned to last. But it is not universal. Life does not require fear, only some way of staying within the narrow band of conditions where it can go on. Some organisms achieve that through complex anticipation, like us, and some through simple automatic responses that never bloom into anxiety. When we remember that, our own fear becomes a little less absolute, more like one strategy among many that the Earth has tried. If we let our thoughts follow those fearless beings for a moment, gliding through black water or resting in tiny pockets of brine beneath a glacier, we may find that certain human worries loosen their grip just slightly. What if some of the shapes we project into the dark are echoes of environments we no longer live in? What if not every unknown corridor in our lives deserves the full alarm of our ancient nervous system? Because somewhere in the next part of this journey, we're going to step back out from our inner landscape and return to the ice itself, and ask how these very different ways of meeting the dark might guide the choices we make about the world still hidden beneath our feet. A slow recap. Threads woven in the dark. So before we step fully back onto the ice and its questions, let's let all of this settle for a moment, as if we were watching snow drift down over a very quiet field. Make yourself comfortable and let your mind wander back, slowly, through the places we visited together in this dark, hidden world. We began in the deep sea, far below the last trace of sunlight, where the water presses in from every side with a steady, unchanging pressure, and pale worms, drifting jellies, and soft-bodied sea cucumbers move across the seafloor in a kind of slow motion. Then we sank further, into trenches that cut miles beneath the ocean's surface, where even bioluminescent sparks grow rare and life endures in a patient, almost silent way for years at a time. From there, we turned sideways into caves, into limestone corridors and flooded caverns where Mexican blind cavefish glide through black water, their eyes reduced to scars, their skin drained of pigment, feeling the world through vibrations and taste instead of light. Now, picture what happens when we go colder still, under the weight of a glacier, into subglacial lakes and thin channels of brine threaded through sea ice, where microbes and tiny invertebrates live beneath meters or kilometers of ice that have never once let the sun directly touch them. We even squeezed into the pores of rocks, into the hairline fractures beneath the continents, where films of water cling to mineral grains and microbial cells sit almost motionless, dividing only every few years, yet still alive. In all of these places, from ocean trench to cave pool to ice channel, the same patterns kept appearing. Eyes that have shrunk or vanished, pigment that has faded away, daily rhythms that no longer matter because there is no day and no night at all. Instead of sight, these creatures lean on chemical and mechanical senses. They taste the water, they feel currents, they register the faint touch of a predator's wake or the slow seep of a nutrient-rich spring. Their nervous systems are often simple, more like nets than brains, coordinating reflexes and movements without the layered processing that, in us, gives rise to stories, memories, and the emotion we call fear. So when we say that many of them cannot experience fear as we do, we're not saying they are careless or unsafe. Their bodies still startle, still withdraw, still escape. But an amphipod in a trench or a worm in an ice channel does not lie awake imagining what might go wrong tomorrow. It reacts, and then the water is just water again. We often picture Earth as a bright blue world, full of sky and sunlight. Yet for most of the biosphere, light is absent and irrelevant. And if anything like fear exists there, it must be something quieter and simpler than our racing thoughts. If some of the details we've passed through have already blurred at the edges for you, that's all right. What matters is the gentle sense that beneath the surface, under the ice and rock and ocean, there is a vast, dark, living world that does not need light and does not feel danger the way we do. Follow me then as we return to the ice above it all and ask what it means to explore such a world when our own senses and our own fears were shaped for somewhere else entirely. Micro cliffhangers in the dark. What we still don't know. We come back up, in our minds, to the ice above, but we don't leave the darkness behind. We carry it with us like a quiet question that hasn't quite finished forming yet. Because for all the caves we've mapped, all the trenches we've dropped cameras into, all the subglacial lakes we've touched with careful instruments, there is still far more we haven't seen than we have. We often picture the deep ocean floor or a cavern beneath a mountain as empty until we arrive, as if life is waiting politely for our lights. Yet in the deepest trenches, where the pressure would crush a submarine hull, amphipods and worms and strange soft-bodied creatures move slowly through the sediment, and in limestone caves, blind fish and pale insects feel their way along walls that have never known the sun. Under Antarctic ice, in lakes sealed for millions of years, microbes drift in cold, still water that no ray of light has ever reached. And beyond those examples, in trenches we have never lowered a camera into, in subglacial pockets we don't even know exist, entire communities may be living and dying without our knowledge, right now. We're going to be honest with ourselves here. We do not know how many kinds of life this hidden world holds. We can infer, we can model, we can say that where there is a little chemical energy, there might be bacteria, and where there are bacteria, there might be tiny grazers. But the full diversity is still a dark shape at the edge of our understanding. Make yourself comfortable with that uncertainty for a moment. It's not a failure, it's an open door. And even when we find a creature in this darkness, a blind cavefish or a jelly-like animal with no real brain, we cannot yet say with certainty what its inner world is like, if it has one at all. We can watch a shrimp startle and dart away when a current shifts. We can measure stress chemicals. We can trace nerve signals. But does it feel something that we would dare to call fear? Or are we only watching beautifully tuned reflexes, empty of the emotion we project onto them, because we know our own hearts so well, and theirs so little? Now, picture what happens when we push these questions to the limits of life itself. In some rocks beneath the Antarctic ice, microbes divide so slowly that a single generation might take decades. In the deepest sediments of the sea floor, cells seem to persist for thousands, perhaps millions of years, barely repairing themselves, barely breathing in chemical terms. How little energy is enough for life to keep its grip? How long can an organism remain in this near stillness without quite letting go? Somewhere between motion and fossil, between living and almost not, there is a boundary we have not yet traced. Follow me, just a little further, into the implications of that. If we find creatures that live almost outside of time, that never see light, that do not startle, that do not flee, what happens to our ideas about fear and consciousness, and what it means to be awake in the world? If a whole ecosystem can thrive under a glacier, running not on sunlight but on slow chemistry in the dark, How sure are we that light is necessary for complexity, or that a nervous system must feel in order to survive? These are not just scientific puzzles. They are mirrors held up to our assumptions about what life must be. So as you slow your thoughts, you might let these unanswered questions sit in your mind like small, steady lights glowing softly in your own inner dark. Each one is a point of curiosity, a tiny lantern hanging over some trench, some cave, some hidden lake we have not yet reached. And somewhere ahead of us, under ice we have never drilled through, and in waters no probe has yet disturbed, there is at least one discovery waiting that will not fit our current picture at all, and will force us to decide what kind of explorers we really want to be. Letting your thoughts drift like deep-sea snow, and will force us to decide what kind of explorers we really want to be. For now, though, we don't have to decide anything at all. We can let that question, and all the others, drift. So make yourself comfortable if you haven't already, and follow me away from the bright edge of curiosity, and down into something slower, softer, closer to sleep. Imagine we turn our gaze from the instruments and the ice cores and the maps, and we simply look up through the dark water beneath the Arctic ice. Far above, at the frozen surface, storms are moving, ice is cracking, years of snow are being pressed into a glacier's dense blue heart. But down here, in this cold place, something else is happening. Tiny fragments of life, crystals of ice, grains of dust, and broken cells are all sinking together in a gentle, endless fall. Scientists call it deep-sea snow. Now, picture what happens if we let your thoughts behave like that snow. Each idea, each leftover detail from the day, each half-formed worry becomes a small, pale flake, slowly turning as it settles through a deep, still column of water. Nothing rushes. Nothing needs to be sorted before morning. Some of those flakes will reach the bottom and rest. Some will dissolve on the way down and simply vanish into the dark. As you watch that snow drifting, we're going to match it to your breathing. Inhale slowly, as if you're drawing in the quiet weight of the deep ocean, feeling the cool pressure of water and ice around you. Then exhale just a little longer, as though you're releasing a cloud of tiny particles that immediately begin to sink, down and away, in and out, rise and fall. We often picture fear as something sharp and bright, like a sudden light switched on in a dark room. But the creatures we've met tonight, the jellyfish with no real brain, the blind worms in subglacial lakes that have never seen the sun, do not live by anticipating what might go wrong tomorrow. They pulse, they feed, they turn, they rest. They respond to what touches them now, and then the signal fades back into the background. So as you breathe, you can let any lingering questions about this hidden world do the same. How thick the ice is, how old the water might be, what kind of microbe could be waiting under the North Pole's glaciers. All of that can sink softly to the back of your mind, like silt settling on the deep-sea floor. You can sift through it later, if you feel like it. Or you can simply leave it there, undisturbed. Right now, you do not need to explore anything. Not the Earth, not the future, not even your own thoughts. Like life beneath the ice, you are allowed to exist without planning, without rehearsing, without fear. Just breathing in this moment, under a sky of frozen water, while the last bright pieces of the day fall slowly past and disappear into the dark below. A gentle summary, worlds that never needed the sun. So as we rest here, under this imagined ceiling of frozen water, we can gently gather together everything we've seen in this long descent into the dark. We often picture the Earth as a bright blue marble, washed in sunlight from pole to pole, but vast portions of our world have never met the sun at all. Not for a second, not in all the years since ice first crept across rock and ocean. Beneath glaciers, in caves that twist away from every entrance, in deep-sea trenches where the pressure would crush a submarine, there are places where light has no history. And yet, life is there, patient, unhurried, almost indifferent to the drama playing out up at the surface. Bacteria whispering along grains of sediment, tiny crustaceans feeling their way through black water, blind cavefish tracing currents with the faint touch of their lateral lines instead of eyes. Now picture what happens when evolution realizes that light will never arrive. Eyes cloud over, then disappear. Pigment fades because there is nothing to reflect or absorb. Even the daily rhythm of waking and sleeping loosens and drifts. Fear, too, begins to change. Not the quick reflex that makes a worm curl away from a touch, but the more elaborate, costly machinery of constant alertness, of scanning horizons that do not exist. In these hidden rooms of the planet, that kind of vigilance is often an unnecessary expense. A jellyfish with only a soft nerve net, a worm buried in Antarctic sediment beneath the ice, a microbe sealed in a subglacial lake for hundreds of thousands of years. They respond, they withdraw, they endure, but they do not pace the floor of their own awareness. There is no sunrise to anticipate, no sunset to dread. It can be tempting to say that something is missing there, that without eyes or color, or what we call fear, these beings are incomplete. But they are not missing anything they need. They are perfectly tuned to their cold, deep homes, as finished and as sufficient as a snowflake forming in still air. Not less than us, just arranged around a different center. If we slow our thoughts for a moment and follow me back through these worlds, we start to feel our own assumptions soften. We're going to see that life does not require light, or even our familiar emotions to be whole. It only requires a stable enough place to persist and time. And that realization quietly changes the scale of our worries. The fears that fill our bright days begin to look very local, very surface-bound, compared to the calm that has settled for ages beneath the ice. So, as we begin to rise toward the end of this journey, make yourself comfortable again. Thank you for staying with me in these dark, unhurried spaces, for letting your attention sink into a world that does not know the sun, and perhaps does not know fear, yet is still very much alive, just here, just breathing with the earth in the cold and the quiet. Soft farewell from the edge of the light. And if by now your eyes are heavy, or your thoughts are moving more slowly than when we began, that's all right. We're going to let this world beneath the ice recede a little, like a tide going out in the dark, leaving only a quiet shimmer of memory along the edge of your mind. You have spent these minutes, or perhaps what feels like years, wandering through a hidden landscape of cold water, soft bodies, and simple nervous systems that do not tighten with fear the way ours do. And we're grateful you chose to drift here with us, when you could have stayed up at the bright, restless surface of the earth instead. We often picture the deep as a place of danger and panic, of teeth and chase and flashing alarm. But tonight we've met creatures that move without dread, that live entire lives under constant pressure and absolute darkness, and never once know what sunlight is. If you're listening to this while you're about to sleep, or halfway between waking and dreaming, you don't need to do anything more. You can just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. Make yourself comfortable, and let the last images fade. Imagine those blind cavefish drifting through limestone passages, or the jellyfish whose nerve nets only register touch and flow, not stories, not worries, not fear. Their world is small, and yet complete. This channel exists as a kind of quiet refuge like that, a calm cavern carved out beneath the noise of the day, where we can follow strange questions down into the deep, and slow your thoughts enough that science feels less like a test and more like a lullaby. Not a place of urgency, but of gentle curiosity. Not a race to know everything, but a slow walk through the cold corridors of the planet and the even quieter corridors of the mind that is watching it all. If you'd like more nights like this, more slow descents into the dark corners of nature and the hidden machinery of life, you're welcome to subscribe, or simply return whenever the world at the surface feels too bright, too fast, too loud. There is no schedule you have to keep, no pressure to remember or react. These journeys will be waiting the way a glacier waits through seasons, holding its deep stories in the ice. Before we go, carry one small fragment of tonight with you. Most of life on Earth does not stand in the sun. It rests in darkness, beneath ice, inside rock, in trenches and caves and subglacial lakes, living without fear as we understand it, simply responding, simply existing. When your own worries feel large, you might remember that immense calm background of life, breathing slowly in the cold. From here, the voice can begin to thin out, like distant wind over snow, leaving just the hush of whatever ambient sounds surround you now. We're going to step back from the edge of the light and let the music or the silence hold you. You can stay here as long as you like. We'll meet you again, somewhere deep, somewhere quiet, somewhere just beneath the surface of sleep, drifting off with the fearless creatures. As we step back from the edge of the light, follow me one last time, not with effort, but with that soft drifting that happens just before sleep, when thoughts stop insisting on being sharp around the edges and begin to blur, to loosen, to sink. Make yourself comfortable wherever you are, and let the room and the night and the quiet become a single, gentle place around you. Now, picture what happens as we turn away from the surface and begin to descend, slowly, through dark water. Above us, the last hints of light from the world we know fade and thin, like memory after years have passed. And beneath us, there is only depth and calm and the steady pull downward. We often picture the deep as something threatening, but here the pressure is simply a constant embrace. The cold is steady and nothing rushes. Around us, creatures move with the same unhurried patience. A blind amphipod drifts past, pale and almost transparent, its tiny legs paddling in a rhythm it has kept for longer than we have kept written history. A soft-bodied worm curls and uncurls along the invisible slope of a buried ridge. Far away, barely a suggestion in the water, a jellyfish pulses, its nerve net guiding it without hurry, without a story about danger or safety, just motion in the dark. As we sink, imagine your own worries staying behind near the surface, where the last scattered light still flickers. Each concern is a little glimmer far above. Something you said, something you haven't done yet, something waiting for you tomorrow. With every slow breath, those points of light grow dimmer, not gone, just distant, like a sky you are turning your back on while the deep world beneath welcomes you in. We pass, in our minds, under an ancient glacier, into a hidden cavern where the ice arches overhead like the ceiling of a quiet cathedral. That's what a glacier is here, not a threat, but a roof, a shelter of frozen time pressing down in a way that never changes from one heartbeat to the next. The creatures in this cold chamber do not count days. They do not miss the sun. They simply are. For a little while, you can join them. You do not need to anticipate the next thing, or rehearse old moments, or measure how long this descent will last. You can let your thoughts move like those fearless beings, responding gently when something touches them, then settling back into stillness. If another thought arrives, you notice it like a faint vibration in the water, and then you watch it drift upward, back toward the bright, busy surface of the earth. Beneath the ice, beneath the waves, beneath the crust of continents, these quiet lives continue in their slow, fearless way, whether we are awake to think about them or not. So it is more than all right to let go now, to allow your breathing to deepen, your muscles to soften, and your attention to dissolve into the same neutral dark that cradles those hidden worlds. If sleep comes, let it come, like a gentle current carrying you along a valley carved in ice over thousands of years. If you simply rest, that is enough too. You are already part of this deep, calm world we've been visiting together. We're going to leave you here, in this safe darkness, just beneath the surface of sleep. The journeys will be waiting when you return. For now, we'll say a soft goodnight and let the silence take it from here.